Hello viewer, welcome to a discussion on social movements. In this discussion, we will be developing an understanding the whole phenomena of proliferation of social movement in the context of availability of sociological literature on social movement, its dynamics of change and transformation, and also we will be looking how these social movements are conceptualized from varieties of sociological perspectives. In doing so, let us begin with the whole notion of social movement, how it has been seen in the literature and also in the common man's perspective. Usually when we talk about social movement, we usually consider it to be an exceptional phenomenon, but social movements are not to be seen as an exceptional event. These are part of the society, part of the revival of human thoughts and action, and part of a collective initiative of the people of society. These are part of social progression. As people and the society changes from one stage to another, social movements will take shape in its own course. Usually it is talked and thought of that social movement live in the heart of the society. It lives in the heart of the society in that way. Society is a living being, is a creative being. Within this whole creativity, there is the existence of social movement that evaporates new kinds of thoughts and action for the society to change its own kind of a course and direction. Many of the thinkers, especially Manuel Castells, widely talk about the social movement of the prophet of the present. It prophets in that sense, it predicts what kind of society is going to arrive in terms of the present thoughts and action. In doing so, what the social movement does, social movement brings out varieties of social anomalies that is existing in the society, and also suggests various means and ways by producing new ideas and thoughts so that those anomalies can be rectified in the present society. And in that way, what the social movement does, it creates a space, a democratic space, and also it generates new ideas in the society. So when we talk about social movement, what we think we are usually having in mind that social movement talks about the transformation of the society, social movement creates a democratic space in the society, it generates new ideas, it talks of the justice, equality and fraternity in the society. So this is generally we talk about society both in the common sense and also in the sociological literature. But when we are conceptualizing social movement in the sociological literature, we will have to have a kind of a specific kind of connotation of understanding of social movement. When we are understanding social movement or conceptualizing social movement from a sociological perspective, we have to accept that social movements are the organized effort. These are not scattered kind of effort. This is not a mob. This is an organized effort. And these organized efforts wants to bring certain changes in the thoughts, the way we think. Our thinking is based on our historicity, our thinking is based on our culture, our tradition. So it wants to bring a change in our thought process. It tries to bring a change in our belief processes. What do we believe and how do we act? It tries to bring a change in our values, in our attitude, in our relationship with other segment of the society, other people of the society, also in the other societies. It tries to bring a change simultaneously, the major institutions like family, marriage, kinship, the bureaucracy, and also simultaneously social processes. Social processes means the education, socialization, media, the way people are socialized. So it tries to bring in all those elements, all those kind of changes in those elements of the society. So just to again sum up that it tries to bring a change in the thoughts, beliefs, values, attitude, relationship, and major institution processes in the society. Social movement also simultaneously try to resist changes in the above element. Many of the social movement may be pro-change. Many of the social movement may be pro-tradition try to resist the changes. So we are having two varieties in social movement, that is pro-change and simultaneously pro-stability. When we are talking about this kind of a societal element, a collective effort, that is what is important, quote unquote, this is collective. When we are talking about it's a collective effort, so it is to be founded on, it is to be organized by particular organization. Until unless a social movement is guided by certain organization, it can be scattered. But there is no logical correlation whether the social movement should come first or organization should come first. It may so happen that it is out of people's initiative, mobilization is taking place, and what you find an organization is cropping up. What is important, until unless there are organization, social movement may not sustain for a longer period of time. So when there is organization, it is important that a social movement should have identified leadership, and identified leadership will give direction to social movement, and direction in terms of other kind of activities. I am coming little later, in terms of interest articulation, in terms of collective mobilization, also developing interlinkages with varieties of other institutions and other kind of social movement may be taking place in the other part of the globe or in the other part of the society. So what is important? First, it should have an organization, it should have a leadership, and the third important part, that it should have an ideology. Until unless a social movement having an ideology, it can't sustain. Well, it is the ideology that gives an worldview. It is an ideology that gives legitimacy to the action, legitimacy to the claim, legitimacy to the demand. So what is important, that a social movement should have certain ideology. And based on these three, there is also interest articulation. A social movement will articulate the interest of the people. What is the interest? What is the demand of a social movement? What do they want? That is to be articulated in a very precise and attainable manner, because many of the interest articulation may not be attended. So that may be long-term goal, there may be short-term goal. So there may be interest articulation, those are to be attended immediately, and some of the interest, those may be attended subsequently. What is another important component of social movement is that collective mobilization. Collective mobilization lays the foundation of social movement, because it is without people there can't be social movement. So there should be a regular collective mobilization to rejuvenate the people, about the interest, make the people about the ideology, make the people aware of those organizations, make the people aware of the new kind of changes taking place in the society. So what is important? There should be a regular collective mobilization. Another important component, we talk about the developing linkages and alliances. Social movement, many of the social movement in the contemporary world, they can't sustain themselves without developing alliance with the outside world, with the outside group. Take into consideration Dalit movement, develop alliances with the indigenous movement. Simultaneously, Dalit movement develop alliances with the workers movement. Workers movement develop alliances with the peasant movement. So there is always a kind of interlinkages and alliances of varieties of social movement among themselves and between themselves. And social movement also founded on a community of followers. That is, no social movement can sustain without the followers, participants and the sympathizers. So they have to create a body of the followers and also participant, and a section of the people may not be participant, but they are the sympathizers. The most crucial among all those things in the contemporary world is the identity formation. That is, social movement creates an identity. Identity talks about the change. Identity creates a new meaning for collective action. So what is important, that when we are talking social movement, we have to take that any social movement which is taking place and sustaining in the world should have the following component. First, it should have an organization. Second, it should have a leadership. Third, it should have an ideology. Fourth, it should have the element of interest articulation. It should have the whole process of collective mobilization. Then it should have a capacity of developing linkages and alliances with the other social group. It should also have the community of followers and participants and sympathizers, and it should inculcate a kind of an identity. It is through that identity they develop a sense of feeling of we, simultaneously a feeling against the others. So what is important, that social movement always founded on a collectivity, that collectivity develops a sense of belonging, a different kind of a meaning through this belonging and interest articulation. So these are some of the vital elements of social movement to be taken care of when you are studying social movement. Now, social movement, as we told, it's a part of a social process, is a part of a society. But not that always social movements are manifested. Social movements are manifested because of certain phenomena. Usually it is thought of, conventionally it is thought of, it is because of the structural strain in the society. It may be structural strain because of the arrival of a new culture, or there may be technological innovation. So when there is a new cultural elements or new technological innovation in the society, there may be structural change, because those innovation looking for its own space, and that is posing certain challenges in the existing social arrangement or social structure. So what is important? Structural strain we have to understand that produces social movement. That may be one of the reason for the manifestation of social movement in many parts of the world. There may be simultaneously status inconsistency. Status inconsistency among the people in the society in terms of economic inequality, in terms of cultural inequality, in terms of political inequality. So when there are inequalities and inconsistencies, there may be manifestation of social movement. Third, another part, important part, usually talk about the relative deprivation. Relative deprivation means again the similar kind of deprivation. There may be economic deprivation, there may be cultural deprivation, there may be political deprivation. So all those deprivation may lead to a kind of a movement in the society that look for a change in the institutional arrangement of the society. There may be simultaneously another important that people may look, that is, okay, here is a society, it is continuing for several centuries, and now there is a need for cultural revitalization. So there is a process of rejuvenating a new element, rejuvenating or bringing a new element, cultural element in the society, and that look for change in the structural arrangement of the society. So what we find that usually traditionally it is thought of, it is the structural strain, status inconsistency, relative deprivation or cultural revitalization that may contribute to the manifestation of social movement in society. But social movements are also thought of in terms of certain perspective. That is, that perspective itself talk about the manifestation of social movement. Usually when we talk about social movement in the social science literature till 1920s, social movement was not incorporated in the sociological or social science literature as an area of studies. And it has started considering, because what it was considered till 1920s or before even around that time, the social movement brings a lot of anomalies in the society. It destabilizes the social order. But many of the social scientists also started talking about social movement and the dangerous social phenomenon, because it brings destability in the society. So in that way they avoided. The avoidance came especially from the collective behavioral perspective. They thought social movement as non-institutionalized collective action. These are not guided by existing norms. These are formed to meet undefined or unstructured situation and bringing breakdown either in some organ of the society or in the other normative arrangement of the society. So they consider social element of the social movement as the aberration. Social movement are not the regular. Social movement are not institutionalized. So these are not considered within the scope of sociological or social science literature or social science investigation. Similarly, the functionalist scholar, they also consider social movement as the potential agency of social disruption. By considering it, they avoided social movement as an area of the study. But it was for the first time the symbolic interactionist like Debal and many others, they thought of that social movement because it brings in new thoughts and action. By bringing in new thoughts and action, it produces new sign of life. And they thought within the social movement, within the whole potential of questioning, whole potential of giving an alternative view to life, it produces a new sign of life. And they considered that within the social movement, there is all potential to look into the society in terms of newness. So what are those newness in terms of new thoughts, new action and new cultural revitalization? So these are the perspective gradually from an area of non-recognition, an area of recognition came with the symbolic interactionist. Then we find it was the Marxian social scientists, they started considering social movement as an important area of the study. But the limitation of the Marxian perspective was that it was widely guided by economic determinism. Whatever social conflict, they considered to be the class conflict. Conflict between the owners of the means of production and the non-owners of the means of production. Conflict because of having possession and control of the ownership of the means of production or non-control over the ownership of the means of production. So Marxist scholar usually because of their economic determinism, because of their overemphasis on the economic factor, they try to consider social movement only in terms of the class movement founded of contradiction between the haves and the have-nots. Gradually, the social movement perspective, as it was nurtured within the whole ambit and understanding of symbolic interactionist, got enormous kind of patronage in the understanding a group of scholars in North America. They are the political process theorists or the resource mobilization theorists. The resource mobilization theorist or the political mobilization theorist, they try to consider the popular protest in terms of its manifestation in the society. They thought that a popular protest in the society emerges due to the political opportunities caused by involvement of the state with the welfare activities and the parliamentary politics that accommodated collective mobilization and gave legitimacy to the petitions, demonstrations, strike, mass meetings and so on as a democratic process. How the American, North American society, the America and Canada especially, they thought of here the democratic society. The democratic society, because of its welfare activities, it is encouraging the people to write petitions, make demonstration and also simultaneously make mass meeting and mass mobilization to assert their demand in the society. So asserting the demand and mass mobilization part of the democratic process. So within this process the space was created for the mobilization of the people. So what they thought of, it is the popular protest evolved not autonomously because of the opportunities were available within the welfare perspective of the state and the social movement emerged. And secondly, they thought it is a part of a political process. How it is a part of a political process? It is a political process to get share of the political power by using various resources. The resources means the economic resources, the people resources and also simultaneously political resources. And they talked about the movements are manifested when the required resources are pumped into the movement by the rich for their benefit. So again they brought in the element of rich and the poor. And who are the people mobilizing? It is the rich mobilizing because they are having the resources to pump for a movement. So it is in terms of gratification of certain need of the society. So social movements are organized by a segment of the society for their own purpose. So what they talked about, it is a kind of economic calculation, the rational calculation of give and take. And the pursuit of common interest and rationality of human action, because it is through the participation people will gain something. So there is a rationality of participation and rationality of the result. So whereby participants in the social movement will calculate their cost and the benefit. So what is the cost of participation and benefits of participation, and accordingly a participatory culture of collective mobilization will take place. So what they are saying in brief, they are saying that social movement emerged because of the space given by the welfare state, number one. It is also simultaneously talking about social movement is a part of a political process, and within the political process it is the rich, those who are pumping the money for their own benefit. Then it is talking about those who are participants, they are also calculating what is the cost of participation, what are the benefits of participation. So it is a more of an economic return, the rationality of behavior through which social movements are taking place in the society. They also simultaneously talked about a category of the American scholars, especially McCarthy, Gillard, and also Tarot. They widely talk about the framing and contentious politics. So what is the framing? They talked about social movement generates a demand for social movement. Because there is a demand for social movement, demand for mobilization of the people, and the demands are sufficed by the political entrepreneurs by responding to that movement. So what they do, the political entrepreneurs, they construct the social movement, also construct counter social movement. It's a kind of a business engagement in terms of entrepreneurship they talked about. And in the process, when there is a matter of construction of social movement, they gave the idea of, that is a kind of a construction in terms of certain situation, motivating the people to construct a world. Here is a world that can be achieved, and that can be achieved only through collective mobilization and through popular participation. So they constructed the world about there that is to be achieved. Or simultaneously, what they started doing they started naming certain grievances, framing certain grievances. So by doing so, they are in a position to bring larger number of the people in the process of mobilization. So what we find in the process of continuous contentious politics they talk about, there is the process of construction of movement by constructing the grievances, constructing a world about there, and also constructing a kind of an image of political opportunities that can be attained through participation in the collective mobilization. So by doing so, what they talk about, in the process of construction, there is also an amount of cognitive liberation. Cognitive liberation means a liberation of new kind of a meaning. When you are constructing a new world, you are also constructing a new kind of a meaning for a society through people's participation, and also simultaneously through the participation of the political entrepreneurs in the social movement. Now, so far we have talked about how we conceptualize social movement, how it has been conceptualized conventionally by the Marxian scholar and by the symbolic interactionist. Then we have talked about how it has been conceptualized by American sociologists, like especially the political process or research mobilization theorist. There is also simultaneously a powerful perspective and widely contributed by the West European, especially by the Britain and the French sociologists and social scientists. They talked about social movement in terms of identity construction. It is all about the identity perspective in social movement. And they widely talked about, especially in terms of proliferation of the labor movement and also development of the Western democracies. So they have a different context in conceptualizing social movement, and their context was widely narrated in terms of proliferation of labor movement in Western Europe in 1950s and 60s. And they also simultaneously found that is the development of the industrial democracies. The industrial countries, they had a different kind of democratic society. That democratic society was providing the space for the trade union to organize themselves, to organize the laborers to ask for their own kind of a demand and collective mobilization. It was also founded on the Fabian socialism, a kind of a democratic socialism based on the welfare state. So welfare state in the UK and the West European countries, they provided those kind of a base for the development of social movement in Western Europe in the 15 and 60s. And by doing so, what they did, they provided the wider space not only for the laborers but also for the others, that is the black civil rights, the gender, the human rights, the environmentalists, the varieties of the new issues started coming in. So what the identity perspective started talking about, a phenomenon already was there, and that was widely engineered, widely promoted by the industrial democracy, the Fabian European socialism and also the liberal welfare state that provide the space for the emergence of a new kind of social movement culture. And within that social movement culture, the labor movement, the black civil rights movement, the human rights movement, environmentalist movement, even the nationalist movement started taking place. So it is a kind of a movement that is founded on what they call it in terms of identity, and this identity movement also widely thought of in terms of a new social movement. Alain Touraine in 1980s widely propagated that is a new kind of a movement. Earlier those are the old varieties of the movement. Old varieties of the movement either founded on the economic issues or the class issues, and it was widely conditioned by in terms of interest or economic interest. Then he widely came out of that. He started thinking the social movement in terms of new ideas, social movement in terms of historicity. And what he observed that new social movement are the potential bearer of new social interest, and that social movements are characterized by the realization of historicity, by self-conscious awareness of collective identity. So it is a new social movement in terms of autonomy from the class phenomenon, autonomy from the economic phenomenon. It's a new kind of a social movement because it is talking about the realization of the historicity, realization of the identity. So what is important simultaneously, it is not concrete economic interest they are talking about, they are talking about subjectivity, subjective feeling, the idealism, the essence of element of human existence in the society. So it's also started talking about empowerment in the society, empowerment of the largest segment of the people. So by doing so, they put in the center of the argument of social movement subjectivity, idealism, empowerment, consciousness, people's moral obligation are to be the crucial point, crucial base for identifying people in the society, for taking part in the social movement. So key concern of the new social movement become quite different from that of the other movement, that is a resource mobilization theory. They calculated in terms of economic interest or give and take. Here it is calculated in terms of subjective meaning of participation. It thought of in terms of idealism in participation, a sense of empowerment in the participation, and a global concern and looking for certain local action. When it is talking about identity, it started taking place, those identity construction, because by the time of 1980s and 90s, a vast number of mobilization and vast segment of the mobilization was taking place on the internet and the cyberspace, and those identities are constructed not on physical proximity. Many a time those identities are constructed in the cyberspace. So it is widely talked about when the identities are to have a kind of a consolidation of physical proximities, but it appeared an identity in the cyberspace, identity not in terms of concrete economic interest, identities in terms of ideals. So many scholars started talking about fluidity and fluidarity in the identity. So what they pointed out, forms of mobilization increasingly started taking place in the networks and flows rather than in the concrete place. And gradually the fluid-like characters of the emerging society with increasing unequal flow of people, information, money, images, risk, and practices and emotion with no clear beginning or end point have become dominant phenomenon. So what we find, the identity, it has come away from the reality. It has taken an abstract form, and significantly many of those collectivities do have contradictory interest and goals, because when there is collectivities are taking place in the cyberspace, there is a possibility that those collectivities are not grounded on interest and not grounded in terms of concrete goal. So there becomes the whole issue of considering identity not in terms of interest or goal, rather in terms of a fluidity, that fluidity in terms of presence in the cyberspace, fluidity in terms of interest, fluidity in terms of attainment of the goal. So many of the critics by the time started talking about that social movement in the as a kind of, has emerged as a kind of a phenomenon that is widely guided more of a fluidity of identity rather than a consolidation of the identities. Social movements are taking place, new social movements, especially in the context of globalization. When the globalization, in the context of globalization, social movements are seen as a kind of a global phenomenon. So the end of Cold War and the emergence of globalization has marked the proliferation of a new kind of a movement, what we call the global movement. A global movement which is having the global concern. That global concern are taking place in terms of the question of environment, the human rights, the vision of another world, demand for the recognition of cultural identities. So what we find, a kind of a global concern has taken place. Those global concern are not conditioned by localized interest and localized identity. It's the global identities and global concern. And what we find, gradually there have been a process of formation of a global social movement society with the plurality of social movement taking off in long-term and permanent position in the society on diverse issues and interests. So two important phenomena. One is that a global social movement and the formation of a global social movement society. The global social movement society is not founded on the unique one social movement, that is a human rights movement or an environment movement, rather a kind of interlinkages of movement, what we call movements of movement, that is environment movement, human rights movement, animal rights movement, gay rights movement, women's movement. These are not localized only in terms of certain area or regional area or a national area. It is cutting across the boundary, national boundaries. So in this context, we find a kind of a formation of global social movement society and a movement society, a formation of a global social movement society that has become a reality in the contemporary world in the age of globalization and the age of proliferation of varieties of social movement and their interlinkages across the globe. What usually thought of simultaneously, then when there is a global movement, it has been widely a problematic area, especially for the social scientists to look into whether the social movements are taking place within this, within the given parameters of social movement. It has been widely pointed out by a group of scholars that along with social movement and globalization of social movement, there has also emerged the phenomenon of social anti-movement. What is social anti-movement? It is talking about with the emergence of multiplicity of social movement in the movement society, social movement also encountered an inverted image of social anti-movement. What are those inverted images? Instead of promoting a social or cultural identity, they champion of some of the abstract identity, essence or symbol, or speak in the name of purity and homogeneity. And they champion the absolute and adopt do and die aptitude. When you talk about the social movement, they create a democratic space for expression of the ideas. But social anti-movement, it does not allow that space. It go for absolute, it champion for the absolute and do and die attitude, and it does not promote homogeneity. Rather, it promotes a kind of a homogeneity in the society instead of heterogeneity. So what Vavrika, this is one of the scholar, French scholar, he talk about. They appear in the arena of social movement, also exist. They try to destroy the social movement and fight against them. What he is trying to say that when social movement create a democratic space through its own struggle and mobilization, social anti-movement, they destroy that space for liberal expression, because it talks for absolute, it talks for homogeneity, it talks for a cause which is non-negotiable. So in the way, it creates a kind of a culture of social anti-movement. So what we find, a process of contextualization and decontextualization of social movement is taking place now in the especially in the age of globalization. How it has happened, that is, in the age of globalization and the emerging interplay of several new forces, a large part of the society is undergoing a profound process of socio-cultural decontextualization. We understand that globalization has decontextualized the family values, the institutional values of family, marriage, kinship, the democracy. Even the state has adopted a new kind of values in terms of new structural adjustment program and varieties of so many other economic and political arrangement. So what has it have generated? This has generated a composite process of vertical and horizontal social mobility. There has been vertical mobility for a section of the people and a horizontal mobility for a vast section of the people. Vertical mobility has been taking place for those people, those who are economically, culturally and technologically well off, and horizontal mobility, especially for the economically poor and deprived, they are horizontally mobilizing from one space to that of the other, from rural to the urban areas, maybe as migrant worker or from agricultural laborer to that construction workers. So what is finding, this is also generated new forms of social conflict both locally and globally, and it has radicalized and institutionalized social mobilization and collective action. What has happened? It has happened two contradictory processes. On the one hand, it has radicalized a kind of a social mobilization. It has also institutionalized an element of mobilization by co-opting many of the elements of social movement by the state. So what we find, there has been a process of rejuvenation of several old forces in the new form. Several old democratic process, it has taken a new form, and we find a new kind of a social formation. And within that, the relationship between the state and the social movement has acquired to be quite complicated. It has so happened that is many a time state is unable to provide the space for the social movement to come out, or social movement has been totally anti-state because it has not been able to conceptualize the way the democratic practices through which the state is functioning in the contemporary world. So there has been a kind of a contradictory relationship at time between the state and the social movement. So what we find, a composite social condition with varieties of contradiction. These contradictions are reflected in terms of what we find, the interest and identities. There are always a kind of a correlation between interest and identities. What we find, there is a kind of contradiction between the interest and identities. There is contradiction between the subjectivity and the objectivity, contradiction between the morality and rationality, solidarity and fluidity. There is also contradiction between the structure and process, and framing and cognition, singularity and plurality, social versus social anti. So what we find, the new kind of social order that has emerged in the age of globalization, new social movement that has provided the space with the new identities, but simultaneously social movement has also created a new kind of contradiction in the society, and those contradictions has also produced new kind of social movement in the contemporary world. So what we find, those contradictions are to be conceptualized by social movement, and this needs a wide sociological theorizing and wide sociological intervention to look at what way issues and identities are become complementary to each other, subjectivity and objective becoming complementary to each other, or solidarity and rationality become complementary to each other. So what is important at this way, how the social movement becoming complementary rather than it is becoming contradictory to each other. So here is a challenging situation for the social scientists to look into how the social movement is encountering a new kind of challenge in the contemporary world. Social movement also undergoing a kind of a transformation in the contemporary world. As I told, it is undergoing transformation from the local to a global movement or global to a local movement. But each social movement undergo a process of transformation. Maybe a peasant movement or a farmers movement or a Dalit movement. usually it is talking about that we can negotiate, we can discuss the transformation of the social movement in terms of the transformation of the vital elements of the social movement. But when we talk that this transformation is taking place in terms of institutionalization, many of the time through institutionalization, a social movement ceases to be a social movement becomes a political party. One of the example may be Jharkhand Mukti Morcha in Indian context. Jharkhand Mukti Morcha emerged as a social movement, but when it became a political party, it ceased to be a social movement. So again, many a time there is also theoretical dilemmas, whether only by acquiring political power or only by becoming a political party one social movement cease to be social movement. So this is also another area of sociological investigation. One is to look that issue. In terms of direction of the transformation of social movement, we find many of the social movement, those who are the revolutionary social movement, they have emerged to be revolutionary. Means they are affecting the wider changes and far-reaching changes in the system. Gradually they have emerged to be quasi movement in the society. They are looking for a kind of change in the limited element of the society. So transformation from the revolutionary to the quasi movement. We also simultaneously find that many of the radical movement emerging to be a transformative movement. Radical movements are those movements, they are resorting to non-institutionalized large-scale collective mobilization, initiated and guided by radical ideology for rapid structural change. They are now becoming a reformative movement. Now those are looking for changes to the institutionalized mass mobilization, initiated by guided recognized bodies for a collective change in the society and change in the selective institutional arrangement of the society, and the change are to be guided by the normative and modified ideology of the society. So what we find, the direction of the change, there is a possibility that there is a change from revolutionary to quasi movement and from radical to reformative movement. But there may be vice versa also. A quasi movement may be revolutionary movement, and also reformative movement can also be radical movement. So what we find, there is a process of transformation in the movement from radical to reformative and reformative to radicalized. What is important at this stage, that we find that there is always in the whole process of transformation, there is a complementarity between the radicalization and institutionalization of the movement. The collective mobilization and the institutionalization not necessarily contradictory, but maybe complementary to each other, that paves the way for persistent and renewed efforts towards a just society. And another important phenomenon is that the process of mobilization and institutionalization do coexist, because when there is a mobilization, that mobilization may also get institutionalized, and when get institutionalized, it also provides the possibility of further mobilization in the society. So what is important at this stage to look into that, when we are talking about mobilization, interrelationship between mobilization and collective mobilization and social movement, these are quite interlinked, and this may change with the change of the society, and simultaneously this collective mobilization also bring in change in the other parameters, other vital elements of the society. So let us sum up to whatsoever we have discussed in this lecture today. In this lecture we have discussed the sociological dilemma in conceptualizing social movement. Second, we discussed how it has been conceptualized social movement in the symbolic interactionist theory, in the Marxian theory, and also in the functionalist theory. Then we talked about how social movements are thought of and conceptualized by the political process theories and the new identity theories. Then we talked about how social movement has emerged to be a global phenomenon with the emergence of global society and global social movement society. And lastly, we talked about transformation of the social movement that is taking place with the transformation of the collective mobilization, and linkage between the transformation of collective mobilization and the linkage between change in the society and change in the social movement culture. Thank you very much.